Good morning, afternoon. Welcome to another webinar hosted by the AEF Chair on Technology, Innovation and International Regulation. My name is Esther Zalin Adu, and I'll be moderating today's discussion. Before we start, I would like to mention a few words about the chair. The AEF Fund strives to be a platform that supports academic cooperation, exchanges, programs, and research to disseminate and strengthen comparative knowledge of European and American societies. One initiative that supports our mission is the AEF Chair on Technology, Innovation and International Regulation, which aims to provide interdisciplinary research on expertise on regulatory developments in Europe and America. Through these activities will promote opportunities for cooperation and knowledge sharing among stakeholders across the Atlantic. Today, we are joined by Professor Ron Boschma, who is a full professor in regional economics at Utrecht University and adjunct professor at UEIS Business School of Stavanger University. In the US, we are joined by Professor Yonkyu Su, who is an assistant professor of management and organizations at New York University Stern School of Business. Today's discussion actually marks the second webinar of our new 2026 series on powering the Transatlantic Innovation Economy. The series explores how policymakers across the Atlantic are navigating reindustrialization efforts, targeting critical industries amid an increasingly uncertain geopolitical landscape. Much of this effort centers on deploying public policy tools to strengthen capabilities and advanced manufacturing in sectors ranging from semiconductors, green energy production to quantum computing. How to translate these public policy goals into practical, actionable strategies lies at the heart of today's discussion, which explores the middle technology trap and how to escape it in the age of AI. And with that, I'd like to open the discussion and ask our panel. I will start with Ron. For our audience, how do you define this middle technology trap?
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for having me. Thank you for the question. Yes, I think it's an important question to address, right? Because it came out of the so-called Draghi report, right, on competitiveness that was published in 2024, which had a big impact on thinking and on policy in the European Union. Well, the definition of mid-tech trap refers to the fact that European economies focus on traditional, more medium tech sectors like automotives and industrial machinery, rather than high tech, right, like digital software or AI. And of course, one of the messages of the Draghi report is that indeed the European Union economy is caught in this mid-tech trap, lagging behind the US because of its dependency on established mature industries that hindered the development of those of so-called groundbreaking innovations, right? So also most of the private R&D funding is very much concentrated in those more mature medium tech sectors, and somehow Europe is not really able to get out of this trap, also excelling in more high-tech sectors. Now, there's a lot to say on that. I like the concept in a way because I think it comes also down to the fact to what extent you actually have capabilities present that you could exploit to more in the high-tech sectors. I did some analysis at a more subnational scale, looking to what extent European regions are being trapped. And what we were looking at to what extent they're able to move into more complex products, right? The more sophisticated ones, the ones that can bring high economic returns because you don't have many competing rivals that are capable of mastering the same capabilities. And one of those traps that we identify were that quite many regions, especially in Eastern Europe, but also applying to many old industrial regions that are caught in what we refer to as a low complexity trap, right? So they have capabilities to move into new fields, but only in low complex activities, not in really high complex activities, because they just miss the capabilities to do so. So they're stuck, right? It's really hard for them to get out of that. I'm also a bit critical to the critique that have been posed on Europe being in the so-called mid-tech trap. There's a lot to say on that, right? So one is, I think, is that maybe in the Draghi report there's too much focus on technologies, right? So especially on digital technologies, right? Draghi is also making the point that Europe especially lags behind in all kinds of digital technologies, and that therefore they were not able to create any champions like the US did, as embodied in the success of Google and Meta and Apple and Media and all of those. But what we also have, and that was very much related to that Europe therefore is underperforming in productivity growth, right, as compared to the US. Now, of course, what we know is that is also due very much to the sectoral composition, right, of the US economy as compared to the European economy, in the sense that much of the productivity, the high productivity, is very much concentrated in this high-tech ICT sector in the US, but not so much in other industries, and that also applies to the R&D, the private R&D that is being conducted there. And another critique I have is a bit about, we in Europe we have European champions, right? We have high-tech champions, right? Let me just name a few examples. For example, in my own country, the Netherlands, right? You have ASML, which is the main producer of super complex machines to produce chips, right? And they have almost a monopoly in the world, and they managed to do that. And of course, that is super high tech. Another example is the Danish chemical company Novo Nordisk, right? That is very much focused on diabetes and all obesity care. And so we have a few, but there are in different types of segments of the high tech industry than in the US. And my last comment would be about, as I said, maybe there's too much focus on the high tech sector, right? Because you could, of course, build competitiveness in many industries, including non-tech or low-tech industries, and I think Europe is very, very good in that, and so is almost unchallenged. Think about green activities, including green technologies, right? The US is far behind in those. Europe really has a very strong position in those type of activities, although to an increasing extent, it is feeling also the increasing competitiveness of China, of course, because they're catching up rapidly.
Thank you, Ron. And Yongqiu?
I think he's frozen.
Oh, we may have a slight technical issue. Is it possible you can turn off your video? Or...
My video, yeah, I could do that.
Okay, Yongqiu, from your perspective, how do you define the middle technology trap, especially from your view from the US and also from your research background?
Thank you so much. First of all, let me say what a pleasure it is to be speaking to a policy audience across the Atlantic. It's always a great experience to share the research that you've been doing and to make an impact. So, when I first was approached by Esther to study this phenomenon, I must confess that the term middle technology trap was actually new to me. So, after reading through the Draghi report and doing some soul searching, I found out that it was defined as broadly speaking, an inability to move from so-called middle technologies to high technologies. And to quote the Draghi report itself, it says that, as Ron told us, it's measured by an R&D focus on automotives, machinery, and a general stasis in terms of the top R&D performers. For instance, 50% of business expenditures on R&D in the EU apparently comes from this traditional sector. Contrast that to the US, where you have a huge turnover of firms over the past 2 decades in terms of the top R&D performers. It used to be, oil and petrol, and now we have, IT firms essentially in pharma. And pharma, biotech, and software and computer services nowadays account for at least 85% of business expenditures on R&D. So a huge contrast between the two sides of the Atlantic for sure. Whether that is by itself a bad thing, we can have a discussion on, but assuming that US wants to pivot towards a more US-like system, I have a couple thoughts. So why is it that the US can innovate in these newer fields better than Europe, I guess, is how I'm going to answer this question. And as someone focused on understanding why things in the US aren't working so well always, I have to confess the question took me back a little because, I always think about the US problem, not so much about the European problem. But it helped me think about where the US's innovation strength lies in. So, to set up the problem, the strength of an innovation ecosystem depends on how quickly new disruptive ideas can be generated, developed, and pushed through the innovation supply chain. So, scientists find a new material, inventors make a new product, and firms diffuse them to consumers, right? So, a successful innovation ecosystem needs all three parts of this idea supply chain to work well. And the US lead in IT and life sciences stems from advantages in each part of that supply chain. So, in terms of science, in the idea and generation and sustainment process, the US R&D as a share of GDP has climbed steadily since the 90s, and it's reached around 3 to 3.5% in the 2020s, which is not only above European levels of 2.2% that was stated in the Draghi report, but also greater than the post-Sputnik shock era. So the US is actually expending a lot of resources in the beginning of that supply chain. If you look at the composition of US public spending, it's of course shifted after the Cold War in terms of its emphasis. So the NIH benefit from a peace dividend, so-called, whereby its budget essentially doubled between 1998 and 2003, while the physical sciences did not experience a similar upswing. However, the private sector really stepped up here, especially in the ICT and services sector. So the science behind diode lasers, for example, was being refined by firms in the optoelectronics industry, such as JDS Uniphase, that would bring us the broadband revolution. Nobel Prize-winning discoveries such as the giant magnetoresistance was being commercialized by IBM to create better hard drives. This is the reason why we have gigabyte hard drives. Large firms in the US also banded together in Sematech to research EUV lithography, and this is why we have, sub 20 nanometer chips. And recently, of course, big tech firms are even pouring millions and billions into quantum computing. So the story continues. Moreover, in niche applied areas of science, such as robotics, the US government sustains funding through agencies such as DARPA. Other agencies also copy this model of risky, disruptive scientific funding after the Competes Act of 2007, which mandates the creation of high-risk funding projects like ARPA-E at the Department of Energy. So that's the first part. Lots of funding that's being pushed into that pipe. Secondly, the US also cleared several regulatory obstacles to scaling new ideas since the 1980s. So this is really not a new phenomenon. But just to recap, first off, a reinterpretation of the prudent man rule in 1979 allowed for pension funds to invest in high-risk assets, which increased the funding that could come to venture funds. Secondly, the Bayh-Dole Act in 1980 allowed universities and startups to retain their IP rights, even when their research was funded by governments. Finally, regulatory agencies such as the FDA have traditionally operated new fast-track approval processes for important products or breakthrough products. So coupled with a traditionally strong market for technology, this allowed for a lot of university inventions to pass to established firms, strengthening the pipeline of ideas to firms. And a couple examples here that are famous are the synthetic insulin that came out of Genentech that Roche produced. UDC's OLED phosphors, for instance, is based on university science from Princeton and USC. Wolfspeed, for instance, out of NC State is another spinoff out of universities. So the pipeline of sustaining that new information into the economy has been strong. And finally, good ideas also need good buyers. Even if you push a product through, it needs to diffuse in the economy. And the US has maintained a small number of large incumbent firms that were really actively engaged in science. And that has maintained what we call the absorptive capacity, your ability to absorb outside knowledge that is necessary to acquire new ideas. So this in turn increases the incentives for academics and startups to invent things in the first place, to have an exit. The US also has used federal procurement policies to give firms with disruptive products their first market. So Operation Warp Speed for the mRNA vaccine is just one example out of many. Project Artemis, and we're about to launch on the 1st of April, that goes to the moon, is another. And the SBIR program, I think, is also a unsung hero in this entire story. Conversely, the areas where the US faces the biggest challenges from East Asia are precisely the places where one of the three components is missing. So, for instance, LEDs and LCDs were inventions at the Radio Corporation of America, an American invention. But as large US firms exited the display industry, follow-on products were sold by Japanese and Korean firms such as Sharp, LG, and Samsung. And in more recent history, if you think about the US government with respect to green energy, this is where Europe has an advantage in. It's not really made a lot of procurement pushes on battery technologies the way the Chinese have. And this has allowed Chinese firms like CATL to really pioneer new architectures beyond NMC towards lithium ferrite phosphorus, which is a new innovative sort of battery technology that does not rely so much on cobalt. Same goes for PV cells, which was actually an American invention in the 50s. So applying the same framework to Europe, and I think I'm answering a bunch of the other questions that Esther had in mind. Several conjectures are possible based on the Draghi report. So first of all, in terms of Europe's ability to produce new science, I'm not as worried as I am about the other two parts of the ecosystem, which is that which is to say that Europe seems to have a pretty well-developed university system. It also has a wide expatriate community of excellent scientists from which it can source knowledge from. Of course, we can nitpick. For instance, the best universities tend to be less well represented in the extreme right tail, so top rankings of top 10 or 20 universities. They also have a funding scheme that seems to be fragmented across national and European levels. So centralization a la CERN, let's say in Switzerland, seems to be the exception rather than the norm. And finally, based on this 2024 report that I read from Friedrich Gross, Mengele Presidente, and Jean Tirole, from Bocconi, it looks like European funding schemes at the European Innovation Council seemed a bit too conservative based on my reading of that report. But overall, Europe's overall supply of new scientific knowledge, I don't think is the main problem. Rather, I think the bigger problem is probably the commercialization of existing stocks of knowledge. In other words, the European paradox, as it is called oftentimes, is, I think, the bigger problem. So I want to cite a couple scientific papers here. J. Prakash Nagar and Stefano Breschi and Andrea Fosfuri at Bocconi in 2024 showed that 55% of all scientific articles that were funded by the European Research Council was cited not by European patents, but USPTO patents. Only 9.48% of ERC science was cited by EPO patents. Secondly, the GMR that I just told you about, giant magnetoresistance that IBM commercialized, was a discovery by two European researchers, Peter Grunberg and Albert Fair, who were respectively government scientists at the Jurlic Institute for Physics and academic scientists at the University of Paris. So I think conversion is really a big problem. Finally, even when European startups do spring up, and this is my last point, it is often US firms that snap up these European wonders. So some of the most promising European tech firms, like not only ASML, but ARM, DeepMind in UK, or BioNTech partner or are acquired by non-European incumbents, such as Google, such as Pfizer, and such as SoftBank. So if we believe that more broad-based growth is based on large firms diffusing new technology to the wider economy, it seems like Europe is losing its homegrown startups to foreign competitors, leaving a lot of money on the table. So that's what I want to open with.
Thank you, Yongkyu. Lots to unpack here. Ron, so I'd like to invite you back to discussions to kind of unpack some of Yongkyu's main findings here, because this is quite interesting. So, first of all, I'd like to revert back to my second question as a follow-up, which is, do you see that it could be a gap between the framing of middle technology and some of the findings of the Draghi report? Because it's very clear that what we define as escaping this middle technology trap also encompasses the diversity of sectors that we also cover in Europe compared to the US. So I'd just like to start with that.
Well, I think, yeah, thank you for your question. I think the Draghi report is very clear on the fact that Europe is struggling with this mid-tech trap, and it has huge implications. And I think Juncker was already referring to a number of those. First of all, it is very much illustrated by a lacking digital capacity in the European Union. It also connects to slower diffusion of frontier technologies inside the European Union. It causes underperforming productivity growth. It also very much related to what JK was already referring to as low levels of commercialization of research ideas. But also, I think it has very much to do with the fragmented capital market in the European Union that block scaling up of European firms, and therefore, often European firms, when being successful and when they are about to scale up, they cannot find the funding, and therefore might move to the US. We have seen many examples in that, and therefore the US actually is benefiting from those type of investments just because there's no scaling up capacity in the European economy. And last but not least, what Draghi was also referring to is that there are some kind of regulatory bottlenecks, right, in Europe, which might prevent or lead to a slow commercialization of research ideas just because they want that innovations will find the right regulations, and those might take time, and therefore that will go at the expense of the speed of commercialization, which is often mentioned and especially focused on in the Draghi report. So there are a few issues that are implications of those mid-tech trap that is kind of hurting the European economy, right? So, and I try to mention a few of those.
Thank you, Ron. Then, as a follow-up, considering all we've discussed so far, how would you assess the responsiveness of the EU to the report's main finding, especially under this flagship roadmap called, for example, the Competitive Compass and related policy?
Question to me, yeah. Yeah, okay. Yeah, thanks. I think that the Draghi report was very appealing, right, and has been fully embraced by the European leadership, right? So what I liked about it is that indeed, as embodied in the competitiveness compass, that they embraced the critique and that they immediately try to see where are low-hanging fruits and where they could really intervene in order to tackle those bottlenecks that were put forward in the Draghi report. Just let me mention a few of those, right? So closing the innovation gap, right? That's exactly formulated as one of the pillars of this competitiveness compass. It's about the scaling up issue that I talked about before, right? So what they try to do is now deepen and make the capital market, make it more efficient. Also try to think of how public investments can really speed up that market, so that we will have a venture capital market that can really take up new initiatives that are longing for new capital. I think also one of the actions that have been taken since then is try to ease mobility of talent, try to keep talent because that is regarded as one of the major inputs, right? So for further innovation capacity and make sure that that we might also contribute to frontier technologies. And also, I think it is reflected in all kinds of initiatives that has been taken in order to boost the research infrastructure and make it more geared towards the needs of industries and high tech sectors more in particular. I think another important pillar of the competitiveness compass is what Draghi referred to as decarbonization, right? The greening of our economy. And actually, Europe has been quite successful in doing that, but is feeling much more competitive pressure nowadays from China. So they really try to increase the high tech component of green activities. And the last action they took is to reduce excessive dependencies, right? This is very much going to the issue of technological sovereignty or sovereignty more in general. So, of course, also in line with more recent global tensions and the way that they need to be addressed is to strengthen defense industrial capabilities, right? So there's a huge effort to really increase those type of capacities, especially the ones that have a dual use, right? So military technologies that also have a high civil application, but also to support more pan-European cooperation in that respect, right? So because as it is, and this is what the European Union is about, right? It is not like the US, it's one country, but of course it has 27 European countries. And often what we can see that there's two fragmented markets. There's too little collaboration across European member states, and especially for defense capabilities, that is quite crucial, so that we don't have different types of tanks in Europe, but that we concentrate more resources in order to increase efficiency in that respect. If I can be a bit critical to the competitive compass, is that to me, and this is also what I do a lot of research on, is that the subnational scale is actually missing, right? So there are so many capabilities present at the regional scale that we often tend to forget, which I think should be made part and parcel of this new kind of let's say, industrial policy. It is because the local capabilities that are crucial to really move into new directions are often concentrated in very specific localities, right? So it means that those local capabilities provide opportunities, but they set also limits to what you can achieve in a diversification process, right? So many regions might go for AI, but they might miss the capabilities, and then you should rethink policy and think maybe concentrate on those regions that have strong capabilities, like the Paris region or Oben-Bayern in the south of Germany, and that type of focus is still a bit missing in the competitive compass. Also, the fact to what extent we can tap into complementarities that are available across regions in Europe. So what we tend to forget now and then is that if you really want to excel in a high technology, it also means that you have to combine different type of capabilities that might not all be present in your own region. So, and we have done a lot of research on that. If capabilities would be combined across different territories inside the European Union, if we really could tap into a potential that is still untapped, we really could combine strengths and make much more possible than we actually do right now. So again, Europe consists of 27 EU countries, and what we often observe in reality is that if we look at collaborations in terms of scientific publications, but even more so when you look at technological linkages as embodied, for example, in co-inventor linkages, we can actually observe that there is a national bias towards in those collaboration networks. So the Germans are collaborating with the Germans, the French are collaborating with the French. And of course, when we look at with whom they should link and where are the best complementarities found, in our research, it becomes very evident that they should make international linkages inside the European Union, right? So make crossovers between member states instead of focusing only on collaborations inside member states. So there's a lot of untapped potential in that respect, and I think we should exploit that much more in the future.
Thank you, Ron. Yongkyu, so I'd like to draw you to the next question on what types of lessons should we learn, especially from the US experience in innovation policy, particularly on the areas that Ron mentioned, the role of subnationals, how to ensure that homegrown ideas actually can scale, especially in the EU level, as you mentioned before in your past comments, that oftentimes homegrown startups already get immediately taken up by or in mergers and acquisitions by US and other foreign partners. So focusing specifically on the areas that Ron identified, what lessons should we draw, especially from the US experience?
Well, I think the main thing really is that all of the good work that you're putting in on the supply side of science, commercializing it into prototypes, and then fostering the startup through venture capital funds, which you will try to benefit with all your regulatory forbearance, will be not if you don't have homegrown champions that are buying these things, right? So established firms within Europe need to essentially become smarter. They also need to become more competitive. What does that mean? So it poses sort of tricky problems for competition authorities in terms of smart firms may sometimes need to band together to do the harder research that is required to acquire these firms. So, for instance, a consortium like Sematech, for instance, might or might not be viewed as anti-competitive. And competition authorities have large leeway as to how to think about those things. And I'm thinking about, concretely, I'm thinking about joint ventures between firms to do, standards important research, for instance. So some European level forbearance to let that happen, I think, is going to be important. The areas where the American innovation ecosystem has worked best really are where you have a diversity of firms, not just startup dominance, but startups as well as large firms ready to buy the fruits of startup research. So, the reason we're raving about AI is not just because OpenAI or NVIDIA, these two startups, have suddenly appeared from the ether. It's because Google 10 years ago has laid the fundamental research building on Canadian research, really from Jeff Hinton, that gave us transformer architectures that enabled generative large language models. So that fundamental research, that market making, if you will, capability of large firms is absolutely critical in allowing startups to thrive if we care about startups. The other thing is that on the flip side, there's a really tricky problem for competition authorities, is that in the same time, as you let these firms band together and get bigger and dominate the market, the concentrated market itself can reduce value capture by the startups, the very startups that are trying to exit. So Florian Ederer at BU has some amazing work that shows that in the American economy, the levels of common ownership have grown thanks to the rise of ETF funds and the like. which essentially means that the levels of concentration within the economy is increasing. And in joint work with Bruno Pellegrino at Columbia, they systematically show that this increase in common ownership means that startups are more likely to be acquired rather than go through the IPO route. In other words, they call it the great startup sell-off. Florian also has another paper called Killer Acquisitions within the medtech industry, which shows that in areas where incumbent firms are too strong, they will essentially try to acquire a new upcoming scientific advance and try to bury it, which is what Microsoft gets a really bad rap for in the 90s and the early 2000s anyways. So, it's a really tricky problem. On the one hand, you want the large firms to exist so that they are able and willing to buy new innovations, but on the other, the anti-competitive problems also abound. So that's my 2 cents on that.
And just quickly, Yonki, what about the role of subnationals? For example, how San Francisco's Silicon Valley became the center of the world's technology sphere, or even in New York or in Texas, leading with the green tech revolution.
Yeah.
Could you explain more about that?
Yes, absolutely. So I'm probably going to have to say a couple delicate things as it relates to the European policymaking apparatus, which is that the US has a fiscal as well as a monetary union, such that you're able to direct taxation across all 50 states towards one objective without incurring too much problems, at least not at the level that European policymakers have to deal with. So if a government decides to make Route 128, a hub for in Boston, a hub for sort of biotechnology, it's not going to upset people in Texas or North Carolina, for instance. So, a prime example of this is the national lab systems that were set up during the Second World War. These really weren't, based on political lobbying power at Los Alamos or in Chicago in Argonne or the MIT, Lincoln Labs. Like there wasn't really much politicking, if you will, going into the location of these organizations. So centralization of effort and agglomeration, I think, really allows for economies of scale to abound. And that has really allowed for companies not only to come to Silicon Valley or Route 128 or to Silicon Alley in New York City, but also to stay because depending on how laxly non-compete laws are enforced, that ecosystem also allows for a lot of spin-offs to appear, and that also allows for VCs to find new targets and so forth. So it's a very positive reinforcement mechanism.
Thank you, Yonki. And Ron, final thoughts before we move on to the next section. So, what are some of the key policy or principles or approaches that we can learn, especially from the US experience, considering what you've discussed about the current factors going on in Europe's capital market, for example, the fact that subnationals have not really been mentioned in the Draghi report? What final thoughts would you like us to remember, especially of the way Yonki laid out the landscape in the US in the last couple of decades?
Yeah, thank you. Yes, maybe I can ask this question best when referring to the regional innovation policy that has been implemented in the European Union since 2014, and this has been referred to as smart specialization strategies, right? So what is smart specialization strategy? It's very decentralized policy making that tries to support priorities that have been set by regions in Europe, right? So it's really a very active industrial policy, right, in which they focus on directionality of policy. They make choices, they make informed choices about what type of capabilities are present. Do they allow you to move into something new? And is that supported by local players? So also make it embedded in the region, so that local players can actually recognize themselves, can influence the type of priority set and the type of policies that will be implemented. So it will secure regional support in that respect. So I must say that I've been involved myself quite a lot, looking at what are the policy experiences so far. Because we have more than 200 smart specialization strategies in Europe, right? So you can do some really nice empirical research on that. First of all, what we looked at is to what extent regions are capable of setting in the so-called right priorities, in the sense that they don't try to develop something from scratch, right? But they really stay close to the capabilities they have present in the regions. And one of our conclusions is that they do quite a good job, not in all regions, but in general. They might go for the right priorities. Then it's about, but it's a bottom-up process at the same time. So you involve local stakeholders and all of that. Those might be that might be a range of actors, right? That might be involved. It might be universities, it might be local policymakers, it might be civic movements, and all of that. Of course, private companies, and they sit down together and they decide on what type of policies should be prioritized in that respect. And also, last but not least, a part of that is also to tap into those complementarities I talked about before, right? So it's not only focusing on regional capabilities, but it's also about with whom to connect, with whom to make collaborations inside Europe in order to really facilitate and encourage those type of priorities they have put central in those strategies. These are massive policy intervention programs, right? We're talking about tens of billions of euros, right? So and a lot of experience have been built on that respect. In some cases, it really works well, like in the Basque Country in the northern part of Spain, right? It's very well known for its restructuring of its local economy. It used to be an old industrial harbor region, right, with declining activities, right? The type of mature sectors that Draghi was talking about, and they have been able to transform themselves and to build a new future, and they have been very successful in that. And there are a few other cases where we can refer that have really worked well. Other cases it did not work that well, but that was mainly because the institutional capacity was not there, right? So that those might be Bulgarian regions in which there was a high level of corruption, where that policy did not really land because it is a decentralized policy, right? You expect a lot of involvement of local stakeholders, and if they're not really when they show rent-seeking behavior and all of that, of course, it might not really work. But overall, I mean, the experiences are quite positive in that respect.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Ron. And with that, we now enter our last section. So, as we are amidst one of the greatest technological leaps of this decade, the rise of AI and AGI, how should we envision the role of the public sector in driving innovation, especially with the proliferation already of AI applications? Do we foresee the public sector as a market shaper, adopter, or someone else? With someone else, that could mean, for example, the role of more private sector involvement compared to previous other technological leaps. We'll start with Young Q and then Ron.
Yeah, I think this is a fascinating question, and I think economists themselves are not entirely sure how much of an impact AGI is going to have on the economy. And on the one hand, people like Chad Syverson, for instance, think that this will essentially obviate the need for any work ever after the 2050s, whereas people like Darren Acemoglu say that the effect is actually nowhere. And it echoes the productivity debates that we used to have during the IT revolution, where I believe it was Alan Greenspan during a congressional hearing said that we see productivity everywhere, but except in the IT everywhere except in the productivity numbers. So a lot to be still seen. With that caveat, I would say that the rise of AI and AGI have two implications. First, I think the minimum efficient scale of research has already increased quite a lot. So in order to run research, that uses these kinds of models and runs these kinds of models, you hit a brick wall in terms of the amount of GPUs that you need to produce these models. And that has a couple implications, right? So for the public uh, for public funding bodies, it essentially means that there are efficiency gains from investing in sort of public access to these very large computing resources, which is sort of what the US has already been doing with its supercomputing clusters run by the NSF, but also through the CHIPS Act, which subsidizes a lot of foundry building capabilities within the US. That allows for not only large firms like NVIDIA or Intel or Google or OpenAI to do research, but also allow for smaller firms to do research, which should, in theory, allow for greater diversity. And with greater diversity, you get greater right tail outcomes, i.e., innovation. The second thing I think is it raises a question about the role of the public sector in affecting innovation through procurement policies. I think there's a lot of hope that, for instance, that the government by buying this or that will, I mean, the defense is certainly one of those areas, that it will, A, sharpen the technology, reduce the unit cost of the technology, direct it towards more productive uses such that we climb the S curve. I think the problem here, though, conceptually, is that AI has kind of gotten there by itself, such that you know, the government really doesn't have as much say as it used to have, for instance, in other deep tech areas like transistors, where the Korean War was the first place where transistors were used in proximity fuses, lasers, where the army was the first user for the laser rangefinders. In the case of an ARPANET as well, was first used by physicists that were working for the government. In the case of AI, I don't think the government really has a lot of say, and it's entirely possible that as it tries to use demand pull mechanisms into this area, it might distort the market. So some careful I think care needs to be exercised when you think about demand side policies for AI.
Excellent. And Ron, your thoughts?
Yeah, I think thanks again for the interesting question. Well, there's so much to say, right, on the role of the state, more in general. I think maybe I just pick out a few things. I think Yunqiu already addressed a number of important issues here. I think also going back to the discussion we had before is what the European Union is often depicted is as a regulator, right? So which might be an obstacle for innovation in particular, right? So the EU frequently act as a global regulator, right? Setting standards like in AI, right? So to ensure privacy, security, and what they refer to as fundamental rights, right, of citizens, and therefore, and this is often used against them because it would slow down, right, the commercialization of AI applications and all of that, right? So there's of course a big conflict, if I may put it like that, between the US and Europe right now, right, about this particular issue. So I think that is very important to address. Personally, I don't see it really as an obstacle to innovation in Europe, right? So it just creates a different selection environment, right, and an incentive for AI producers to account for the regulations that are present in the European Union. And if they become standard across the world, you might even exploit it as a competitive advantage, right? Well, the US is complaining that they will not have wide access to the European market because of those regulations, right? So because those AI technologies were developed in the US without too much regulation, especially under the Trump administration, right? So for sure, I think the state should be actively involved. I'm a bit less pessimistic about this demand pool mechanism that Yongqiu was talking about, right? I just take an example like green technologies in Europe, right? Europe has been really active in creating markets. Think about solar panels, think about wind energy, and that turned out to be very effective, right? So and so in that sense, I think through procurement policy, they actually supported that type of development and became very successful in their own right. So for me, yes, I think there's an increased consensus in Europe that active industrial policy is absolutely needed, and so maybe it has a bit there's a bit less focus on market-driven mechanisms as in the US. But still, we are a market-driven economy. But it also is very much focusing on removing bottlenecks experienced by local actors in order to enable the development of those new technologies, including AI. Right. So in that sense, there's a lot of focus on trying to remove those bottlenecks, like the bottlenecks that we talked about before, and that are really focused on in the Draghi report.
Thank you, Ron. And with that, I now end our discussion by asking, looking ahead, is there still hope for EU-US economic cooperation empowering innovation across the transatlantic trade bloc? As it's very clear that both sides of the Atlantic are grappling with similar economic issues, from inequality, how to power inclusive growth, and of course, changing labor market conditions, especially with the incoming of AI applications proliferating both in the workplace and also in consumer markets. We'll start with Yonki and then Ron.
I think that's a very big question, and I'm probably going to just have to grope myself towards the answer here. But I actually think that there is a lot of existing EU-US economic cooperation. I think the more we look at the daily ups and downs of the transatlantic relationships, it's always easy to forget that this is probably the biggest trade relationships that exist between two regional economies. I would also say that Europe is part of a global supply chain in many critical industries, such as Ron correctly mentioned, ASML. Without those machines, it's entirely impossible to stay at the frontier of chip design. I mentioned Genentech. Genentech was eventually acquired by a Swiss firm, Roche. So, and not only to mention Pfizer's, mRNA vaccine was something that was coming out of Germany from BioNTech. So, I think there is tremendous cooperation that already exists between the EU and the US, and I think a fixation on the AI issue, I think, can blind us to some of the cooperation that is already happening. I think AI really makes us think about these issues in nationalistic terms precisely because the capital is immobile, i.e. the chips and the foundries and the hardware required to run these things tend to be very nationalistic. And it also has I forgot to mention policymaking implications for Europe as well, because as you decide where to put that mega data center within the European Union, you're going to have a lot of discussions about who deserves what. And as a reverse to trade policy, where the costs are concentrated but the benefits are diffuse, I would say in AI policy, the costs are diffuse but the benefits are concentrated. And therefore, some tough discussions about supply side policies as it relates to industrial policy will need to be thought of. I think this is my way of not answering the question, which is to say that I think EU-US economic cooperation, despite everything that is happening on the defense and diplomatic side, is still quite strong.
Thank you, Yonki. And Ron, your thoughts?
Yeah, I agree, right? So I think that EU-US economic collaborations is super strong, right? As of course a long tradition. But I must say it's also under threat to an increasing extent, right? Because of the Trump administration, right, imposing import tariffs and all of that, and also because of the insecurity, right, that causes. So I think here in Europe. We have a feeling that there are some ideological differences that were not there before, that have popped up, which might be hard to bridge, right? So I think there's now an increasing awareness in the European Union that the US might not always be regarded as a reliable partner. So that might have major consequences also for the transatlantic collaboration. I hope that is not the case, but I can actually see that in the European Union there is some kind of feeling of rising self-confidence, also because of the sovereignty policy, right? That many, well, almost every part in the world is really embracing. And this is part of this, right? So reducing dependencies also means that we are reducing dependencies from the US, right? Which is, of course, a new thing that we have never thought that we would even think in those type of terms, but we do so to an increasing extent. And I'm afraid that might only be getting worse over the next coming years. So I'm a bit pessimistic in that respect. Hopefully we will have a very strong relationship with the US because it has always been our friend and ally, and therefore I would really regret if we would go into that direction. But unfortunately, I see some tendencies that that go in the other direction.
Thank you both. And with that, we've entered a brief Q&A session. So members of the audience, if you have any pressing questions you'd like to ask our two experts here, please do not hesitate to type in a quick question. And with that, I'd like to already start answering the first question by Aluru, who says, is Europe's lack of high-tech growth due to insufficient funding or inadequate structures? Who would like to answer this question? Okay, we'll start with Yonku and then Ron.
Oh, okay. I can go first. I thought Ron was first. But I think my general thesis was that the problem was the latter. If put in the extreme, um, think about why the Israeli innovation ecosystem is so successful. It's not that they have a lot of money floating around. It's that they have a system of collaboration that allows for university inventions, let's say, of Mobileye, which is this, I think, LiDAR system that most EVs these days use. The ability They have essentially set up a network whereby existing university inventions can rapidly percolate through as ready to scale products. And money is very mobile, and therefore it will travel to wherever good ideas are. So I believe that the incentive structures for pulling out more and squeezing out more innovation out of European universities, I think, is probably the first thing that you want to solve before you start injecting more money into the system.
Okay, and Ron?
Yeah, I think the science base in Europe is overall quite good, right? So we have many top universities, right, scattered around the whole of Europe, right? So it's not even they're very much concentrated in only one or two countries. So I'm quite optimistic about that. I think it's more the kind of institutional framework, right, that could be improved in that respect, right? We already talked. I think one of the major issues is still the fragmented capital market, right? So I think JK also mentioned already some time ago that in the institutional landscape in the US, it was made possible that pension funds, right, could really invest in high risk activities. For example, in my own country, the Netherlands, well, we have big pension funds. That is not possible at all. So they should follow a risk-adverse strategy. So a lot of funding is available, but might not reach those high-risk activities because of restrictive regulations in that respect. So, and this is just one example of that.
Okay. And we have one final question. Can you propose one quick win that can address both the middle tech trap and the incoming energy crisis? Who'd like to take this one?
I think I can try to go with
Go
that.
ahead.
Being completely ignorant about Europe, I think allows me to say dumb things very quickly. But I think clean energy from the Chinese precedent is a clear win for industrial policy, whereby guaranteed demand policies allow for firms to invest in high risk architectures, whether it be new types of photovoltaic cells, but also new types of battery architectures. And they've shown time and again that patient sort of demand guarantees allow for firms to make risky investments in new architectures. So I think a European level target to, let's say, decarbonize or to have X number of electrical vehicles by some year, I think will have a pretty good market signaling effect. And I say that this is a good area for Europe to work on is because even to the emission of the Draghi report, this is where Europe does have a distinctive innovative edge, where it does have very large firms. Unfortunately, some of them were acquired by non-European firms, such as Qcells, for instance, which is now acquired by a Korean multinational, Hanwha. You know, this is, I think, the area you want to start with, unless you're going to change Volkswagen's mind about what they need to produce. I think encouraging new green energy startups to work on wind, solar, and battery, I think is going to be a really good idea.
And Ron, final thoughts?
Yeah, so I think the problem a bit about green activities and green technologies that they are not super high tech, right? So we made also we used the economic complexity indicator by Hidalgo and Hausmann, and then we ranked all those technologies, right? And then we found that in contrast to digital technologies, green technologies are less complex, right? Which means that they're also easier to develop elsewhere. So it means that building a comparative advantage in those technologies might be more easy to do, but it also means as soon as you lead in that respect, also other competitors might catch up and take over, as we have seen in some green technologies already moving to China, right? So I think also I agree with JK about especially the green application in existing industries, right? Is a major challenge, and I think Europe could indeed do job when also there are the right incentive mechanisms, right? So, and I think here we can still improve in order to stimulate that. But yeah, there's a lot to say on that.
Well, thank you both. I think we should leave it there as we have approached the end of today's webinar. But I can say for myself that this was one of the richest discussions I've had this year. So I really look forward to reading your scholarship on this subject in the near future. So I'd like to thank from our audience and AEF, our guest, Professor Ron Boschma and Professor Yonkyu Su, for their insightful remarks in this second discussion of our new series on powering the transatlantic innovation economy. And thank you, our audience, for your participation and questions. We really appreciate it. Have a wonderful week, and I'll see you all next time. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.